Good evening. Welcome to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, John C. Livingston Endowed Lecture, brought to you this year in virtual format. My name is Susan Schulten, Professor of History in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to see many of our alumni and friends here tonight. We are so grateful to be joined today by a number of current and former Alumni Council members. Our board chair emeritus, Doug Scrivener, who remains a passionate student of history, the dean of the college, Danny McIntosh, our wonderful new senior vice chancellor for advancement, Valerie Otten, and our vice chancellor for legal affairs and general counsel, Paul Chan. Thank you all so much for making the time to be here. As many of you already know, tonight's lecture typically includes an alumni reception and kicks off our university-wide alumni weekend celebrations. The college and the university continue to innovate in ways to continue this programming and opportunities for our communities to come together through these virtual formats. Problem solving and critical thinking are keystones of the liberal arts education here at the university. As you already know, the college consists of 15 schools and departments, multiple centers and programs making up the arts, humanities, and social sciences. These range from anthropology and philosophy to religious studies, and of course, political science. We have about 28,000 alumni globally, and currently 2,200 students who major in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences programs, as well as 300 graduate students. Now, normally this would be the part of the program where I ask you to turn off your cell phones. Instead, I want to explain this virtual platform. Through this platform, the audience can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. We will be taking questions through the presentation and key points. So we encourage you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. And for fun, let us know by using the chat box where you are joining us from, and maybe what you studied while you were a student here at the university. We will also be recording tonight's lecture, which will be made available on our website. Now, to the main event. The annual John Livingston Endowed Lecture invites a faculty member from the college to present his or her work to the broader community. The late Professor John Livingston was an esteemed teacher and scholar, and also the longtime chair of our department. He was not only a colleague, but a dear friend to many of us on the faculty, staff, as well as students who had the pleasure of working with him. I know many of you in the audience are former students of his and remember him as one of the most influential times here at DU. Those who knew and worked with John also know that his true partner was his wife, Nancy, and this lecture series honors not just John, but also his wife. Nancy and John came up with the idea for this lecture when he was ill in 1999, and they were trying to find a way to honor his legacy at DU. Nancy Livingston is here with us tonight, a woman who for years continued to carry forward John Livingston's academic legacy by being an active member of our community and helping us with this wonderful lecture series. Thank you most sincerely to Nancy Livingston. And now, our esteemed speaker tonight. We are so thrilled and honored to have Josh Wilson, Professor of Political Science here at the University of Denver, as the annual John C. Livingston Lecturer. Professor Wilson's research investigates the many ways that political and social movements make use of the law and legal training to pursue political ends. Josh Wilson holds a doctorate in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California at Berkeley, and was previously an assistant professor at John Jay College at the City University of New York. You might also want to know, in the true spirit of our college, that he holds an undergraduate degree from Berkeley in English literature, as well as interdisciplinary studies. Josh's work has been published in various academic journals. His work has been discussed in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, The Guardian, NPR, and PRI. His first book, The Street Politics of Abortion, Speech, Violence, and America's Culture Wars, was released in 2013. His second book, The New States of Abortion Politics, was published in 2016, both of those works with Stanford University Press. Josh has also written for Newsweek, Time, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post's Monkey Cage, the Pacific Standard, and other outlets. Finally, the reason we're here tonight is to hear about his cutting-edge research that is part of the forthcoming third book, Separate but Faithful: How the Christian Right is Reshaping Law Through Legal Education, forthcoming from Oxford University Press. This is co-authored with Professor Amanda Hollis-Brusky from Pomona College and will be available this fall. The research was funded in part by the National Science Foundation, and it focuses on the many ways that legal education and legal training relate to social, legal, and political change. Welcome, Professor Wilson.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Sultan. And I'd also like to thank various people who have made this talk possible. Of course, Nancy Livingston for endowing the series that honors Dr. John Livingston, Dean McIntosh for the invitation to give the lecture, Aaron Dietrich, Chris Nolly, and everybody else in events planning, and of course, you, the audience, for spending a little bit more time on a screen. So before diving in to the topic, I want to give a little bit more detail on how the format will go. I was trying to think of ways to manage screen fatigue. So with that in mind, I've broken the talk into two sections that are roughly 20 minutes each. And that'll allow for two separate Q&A sessions as well. So the first part of my talk will be a deeper reach into history. And the second part of the talk will focus more on recent developments within the Christian right. So a good place to start the talk, though, is with defining what I mean by the Christian right. So I think of movements via the institutions that they build. So correspondingly, I think of the Christian right through institutions as well. So we can think about movements as collections of ideas, leaders, grassroots activists, strategies, slogans, policy campaigns, etc. But institutions are a means of ordering all of these disparate elements that comprise movements. And institutions are also handy in that they're tangible entities that can be studied, so we can actually get data from them. So in this talk, and in my work more generally, I'm specifically interested in the internal and external factors that help to mold institutions, and how, in turn, then, institutions influence those who are involved with them and how they understand themselves, their opponents, the wider political and social worlds, and thus how they work to achieve their goals. And so it's important to see that movement actors have agency and they make choices, but they're also constrained in these choices. And so that leads to seeing that the contexts within which they work, the institutions themselves, the choices that are made, and the resulting policies are all constructed, fluid, and contingent. Right? And so this also leads to seeing that there's a complex mix of variables involved, right? And so as a result, there are really few clean, simple answers to how most questions about politics and movements, there's just too many variables involved to have a clean and simple answer about them. Right? Now, with that orienting premise out of the way, the story that I want to tell tonight is about the development of institutions that define the Christian right. Right? So the talk largely pulls from, as you just heard, my forthcoming book with Amanda Hollis-Brusky at Pomona College. And the research, I need to say, was funded by the NSF, and it'll be out with Oxford University Press in October. And so while this book is about the development of the Christian conservative legal movement, and specifically looking at law schools and training programs that are used as support structures, in this first part of the talk, I want to highlight the historic contextual chapter that I wrote as part of the book in order to introduce the institutional developments that happened over the course of the 20th century that allowed for the creation of the Christian right and led to its present day power. Right? So as I tell my students, I tend to mark the start of the Christian right as the turn from the 1970s to the 1980s. You can, of course, pick different markers that are all defendable, but I like this transition from the 70s to the 80s for a couple reasons. So first, it's in this time period that you can find various streams of the emergent new right conservative movement coming to power in various institutional contexts. You can see this within the NRA around 1977. You can see it in the array of Southern Baptist institutions. You can see it with the creation of the Federalist Society and with the general conservative takeover of the GOP. And the other reason why I like this time period is that it's also when we can see the creation of explicitly conservative political institutions by Christian right activists, right? So you get the creation of the Christian right through the creation of explicitly political institutions at this time. And so the institution that I like to point at is, first, is the Moral Majority, which was founded in 1979, and it's arguably the most important early institution in the Christian right. So up to this point in time, white evangelicals were not organized as a political constituency in a really meaningful way. Many had been part of the New Deal coalition, and in 1979, an estimated 45% weren't even registered to vote. So it's hard to see them as a political constituency at this point in time. And so the Moral Majority is the first large-scale, explicitly political institution meant to connect religious conservatives to the GOP as a constituency. And this was soon followed by other political institutions, such as the Family Research Council in 1983, and the Christian Coalition, which we'll talk more about later in the talk, which was founded in 1989. So this focus on the later parts of the 1970s and into the 1980s, however, hides an important longer history that reaches back to the start of the 20th century. So the Moral Majority, even though I want to extend back decades prior to the creation of the Moral Majority, it's a good vehicle for talking about this history. So Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, was recruited by Paul Weyrich because Falwell already possessed various resources that are needed in order to create a political movement. And so he ran one of the United States' largest church at the time, the Thomas Road Baptist Church. He founded a series of educational institutions running from early childhood education through the university level with the Lynchburg Christian Academy and with Liberty University. And his Old Time Gospel Hour television show was carried by upwards of 373 stations across the country. And he liked to note that that was more stations than even carried Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. And he was also an active author and circuit speaker. And so he maintained this national audience in multiple ways. And so this institutional empire reflects a larger parallel world that had been created by white evangelicals over the course of the 20th century. So and this is important to note for at least two reasons. First, this parallel institutional world is evidence of white evangelicals' standing lack of external political and public engagement. And second, this same collection of kind of inward-facing social institutions are what enabled the Christian right to rapidly organize and become outward-facing and politically engaged. So as Gary Jarman, a GOP organizer, noted, quote, "The beauty of it is that we don't have to organize these voters. They already have their own television networks, publications, schools, meeting places, and respected leaders who are sympathetic to our goals." So as I was saying, right, Falwell represents the collection of all these qualities that are really needed to create a political movement. And so that leads to two questions that I want to get at in this first part of the talk. So if they had all this political institutional infrastructure, why weren't they already politically active as a constituency? And then second, what changed this, right? What pushed them into becoming a political constituency? And so again, another thing, common touchstone that I use with my students is to use the Scopes monkey trial in 1925 as a marker for the white evangelicals kind of turn away from the greater public. So during the Scopes monkey trial, which got national attention, white evangelicals were basically publicly labeled as backwards, right? And this helped drive them out of the public sphere. It was also accompanied by theological arguments that highlighted godly pursuits over earthly ones. And so this idea of rejecting politics and other worldly elements, and to be a good Christian, you need to turn away from these things and look really towards godly pursuits. And so the push by these dual forces was also compounded very quickly by the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, right? And these two things led to problems in creating the Christian right as a political conservative constituency. So first, white evangelicals, as I said before, had become a solid part of the New Deal Democratic coalition. But they were part of this coalition not as evangelicals, but rather more as kind of poor rural whites. So this led to a certain loyalty to FDR and a belief in kind of state support, and all these things became problems later that needed to be resolved by the GOP in order to pull them into the coalition. Second, and really importantly, is that the Depression broke up communities and scattered families, right? We really get mass migration at this time period that leads to a really important internal immigration story. So as you can see in the slide that's posted there, I selected 3 different migration trends from different states. And what you can really see from these kind of southwest border states are really large numbers of people heading primarily to California. And a lot of people don't know this, but Southern California really became the future cradle of the Christian right? We think about it as maybe as being geographically in the South, but really it starts and comes together in Southern California in really meaningful ways. So another important thing to notice about this internal immigration story is that those internal migrants really faced discrimination when they entered California. Like I'm sure that many of you have heard of essentially our slurs in terms of calling people Okies or calling people Arkies, right? And this led to the creation of new communities on the margins of established cities in Southern California and basically throughout the state, right? And so you can actually find this geography of settlement that are on the literal geographic margins of where people live already. And as we get these migrations to these new areas, people start creating new communities, right? And they need touchstones to create these communities. And so one of those important institutions were the creation of local churches, right? Churches that could bring the new migratory populations together so they meet each other. Another important element here is radio ministry. Radio ministry became a way of connecting these migrants back with the homes that they had left, right? And importantly also, the radio, the kind of the religious radio networks led to a first fight for what would eventually, decades later, become the Christian right. And there were fights with the FCC over the regulation of broadcasts. But while this is an early entry into kind of a political forum, it was not enough to create them as a political constituency. It was a really narrow issue, right? So the main point to really see here through migration is that it starts to set the initial institutional seeds for later developments, right, that will eventually blossom into the Christian right. So moving forward a bit in time, you get the confluence of the Cold War, the defense industry, post-war economic boom, and the civil rights movement. And all of this works together to essentially water the seed that's already been planted, right? So in brief, there are kind of 3 things that I want to point at in this time period. So the first is to really notice the importance of the existential fear of nuclear war during the Cold War. This really helped fuel what's called the Fourth Great Awakening, and to not only push people towards religion, but to fuse religious identity with patriotic identity. And church attendance had actually been in the decline for decades before this time period, but it abruptly reverses in the post-war time. And as way of illustration, it's good to look at Billy Graham here. So Billy Graham kind of suddenly arrives on the national scene out of a revival in Los Angeles in 1949, where he caught the attention of William Randolph Hearst, who put out the notification to his newspapers to quote unquote puff Graham, right, to elevate Graham, because Hearst recognized Graham as a potential ally in fighting the Cold War. So another way of thinking about this too is if we jump ahead a little bit. In 1957, Billy Graham ran a 16-week revival at Madison Square Gardens in New York. It kept getting, the reason why it's 16 weeks is it kept selling out and getting extended and extended and extended. And the culmination of this was a revival held at Yankee Stadium that drew upwards to 120,000 people, including then Vice President Richard Nixon. Right? And his ministry helped not only bring people to the church, but to fuse Christian identity with American patriotic identity, because part of what grabbed Hearst's attention was that Graham was arguing that the only way that we could defeat communism was through a religious revival, right? If we're going to defeat godless communism, we need to be a godly country. Right? So the second important element to look at in this time period is the defense industry boom in Southern California and elsewhere throughout the Sun Belt and parts of the South. And this is important because it fundamentally changes those recently migratory internal populations. And we can see that in two ways. One is that a lot of the people who migrated out of the South and out of the Dust Bowl during the Depression end up working in the defense industry. And this helps feed that patriotic identity. More importantly, though, it leads to newfound financial stability, right? And this financial stability is coupled with driving or starting to drive some changes in theology as well that begin to fuse capitalism and Christianity together. So we get this de-emphasizing of the Gospel of Matthew that teaches that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God, and instead pivots to promoting how wealth can be a virtue if it's used to create God's plan on earth. Right? And this is important for the story here because as you get an increase in financial stability and this theology that's pushing to realize God's plan on earth, it helps fuel the creation of new and larger institutions. Right? And so this includes the expansion of religious ministry and media. It also leads importantly to a few leaders in those areas becoming very wealthy and then subsequently using their wealth to create a new wave of conservative Christian colleges and universities. So prominent examples here, since this is the University of Denver, one of our rivals in our sports conference is ORU, Oral Roberts University, being one of these new institutions that gets created out of the wealth that comes from these media empires. Then we get to return back to Jerry Falwell and the creation of Liberty University. And then also there's Pat Robertson and the creation of Regent University, which tellingly was originally named Christian Broadcasting Network University. Right? So there's that explicit connection between kind of the source of the wealth and the creation of the new universities. A third important element to note in this time period is that the new wealth and kind of institutions combined with a resistance to integration in this population, which led to the creation of private Christian schools. So the Christian day school movement became the fastest growing program within evangelical and fundamentalist churches in this time. It's also then reflected in the major programs that are offered at Christian colleges and universities. They began producing teachers that can then go work in these Christian day schools. It's also important to note, though, that the leadership of kind of the white evangelical community was really split in this time period over civil rights. And you can see this in a contrast between Graham and Falwell. Graham was very much into this big tent idea of Christianity. He reached out to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and he was, while a Republican, he was kind of a private Republican. He didn't have a public political identity that he was putting out there because he thought it would interfere with his ability to minister. Falwell, on the other hand, was quite different, right? Was not reaching out to the civil rights movement, making various statements actually against the civil rights movement, had not a big tent view of Christianity, but a much narrower view of it. And while he was yet to become a kind of a public Republican, he would eventually. And this split in leadership help keep white evangelicals from becoming a unified political constituency at this time, even though there are these other forces that are beginning to push towards that end. So the cumulative effect of all of this was that we get an increase in the number of white evangelicals. We get this fusion of Christian and patriotic identities. We get an introduction of the beginnings of a bridge between conservative fiscal policy and foreign policy and white evangelicals. And we get an increased sense of efficacy that's really important for political mobilization, right? People don't mobilize politically until they feel like they have some power to do so. And finally, it's important to note that Christian institutional growth in this time period was really matching their shifts in social status over the decades. It was becoming possible to essentially go from cradle to the grave without leaving this insular Christian community. You could get your education, your ministry, your entertainment, and your career all basically within this sphere and have kind of little reason to interact with the outside world in a lot of ways. So in sum, we now have kind of all the ingredients for political mobilization, but we don't have the Christian right yet. Rather, we have kind of the latent elements of its creation. And so we can see these elements, as I kind of started off, in the institutions that Jerry Falwell had, and thus why he was tapped for this final step of creating the Christian right as a political constituency. So in serving as a rough summary of this last step, Falwell strove to create this constituency by collectively attributing the disruptive social and political shifts that had taken place in the 1960s and 70s to secular humanism, basically the displacing of God by man. And you can see that very well in this mural slide from Liberty Law School, right? In the upper left-hand corner, I think it's left for you guys, you can see the circulating books, right? Darwin and books on sexuality that are floating around, these dark clouds, the overturned police car, the protesters, right? This is this kind of summation of secular humanism being the problem, right? And secular humanism was then used as an extension of the ground that Billy Graham had laid. So you don't just need a religious revival to save the United States from the Soviet Union, but you need now Christians to band together as a quote unquote moral majority within the GOP to elect Ronald Reagan and to save the United States from itself, essentially. And Reagan, in turn, courted white evangelicals as a constituency, and thus they started to respond as one. So while Graham called for a big tent revival in the 50s and 60s that would save the country while explicitly kind of avoiding overt partisan politics, Falwell called for true believers to become partisans. He helped create that move by creating a political institution that would enable it, and thus we get the identifiable creation of the modern Christian right. So, as I said, I was going to break this into two talks, so as to limit the fatigue of just hearing my voice. So I'll pause here if there are any questions, and then after that, we'll fast forward a little bit to the more recent past.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. There are a few questions, and I'll be brief here, but one has to do with race, which you began to address toward the end of this first section. And that is, in your talk so far, this has both been implicitly and explicitly a white evangelical movement. Given the enormous and active Black population in evangelicalism, especially in the South in the first half of the 20th century, why don't Blacks figure more prominently into this early developmental stage, even inward, of evangelicalism, right? And you started to allude to a little of that with the split of Graham and Falwell, but maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So the basic elements are, yes, we see this connection through faith, right? Through evangelical faith. But if we're going to talk about the creation of a political constituency, we also need to think about the major political forces that are at work in the 20th century. And there's a lot of political science research about how the rise of conservatism in kind of the post-war era up into the 1980s, one of the really big driving factors for both political parties and kind of the creation of the new new versions of the Democratic Party and the new version of the Republican Party was this split over civil rights. Oftentimes when I teach Intro to American Politics, I talk about this as kind of a modern day Big Bang within American political development, right? And that mattered more than religious identity. Another thing to recognize is that churches are heavily segregated institutions. So one of my colleagues in the department here, Nancy Wadsworth, explicitly does research on this. And so while we have, Baptists, right, who are Black and white, they tend to go to very different churches and are mobilized around different things, right? And so we see Black evangelicals in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, they're the driving force of the civil rights movement, right? And then if we're looking at this institutional history that's being created by white evangelicals, some of it is in reaction to the civil rights movement. And so we have this early divide, this wedge that's getting placed between Black and white evangelicals.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And we have a couple questions that are clustering around one other theme, and I'll ask this and let you then continue on, because the other questions I think might be answered with the second part of your talk. Can you address the distinction between mainline liberal Christians and evangelicals? And then related to that, there was a question about the Scopes monkey trial, and that is, were the true believers reacting in some way to the ridicule of a larger society? In other words, can you elaborate a little bit more on why the Scopes monkey trial serves to be such an important point of departure for your research?
Yeah, great. So the first one, starting with kind of mainline Protestants versus evangelicals and fundamentalists, this is a really kind of fascinating story. Dochuk, I'm forgetting his first name off the top of my head, has some really, do you remember it, Susan?
Darren.
Darren, thank you. I knew it was a D. There's that alliteration, but it was escaping me. But has some really great work on this as well. And if I go back to one of the things I referenced in the talk were those initial fights with the FCC over radio broadcasts, that another way to understand these fights, it was actually about Northern mainline Protestants versus Southern evangelical Protestants. And it was an attempt by Northern mainline Protestants to essentially try to stamp out the emergent kind of fundamentalist and evangelical churches of the South, right? There was this kind of competition that was going on, and that was one of the venues that it took place within, right? And so we can understand these divisions in terms of geography. We can also understand these divisions in terms of social class and access to traditional means of power, right? And so that evangelical versus mainline identity really has a lot of other political meanings that are built in there. So hopefully that addresses that interest. The other question being about the Scopes monkey trial, yes, I think the way you phrased it was, were they turning against ridicule? Yes, very much so, right? It's important to see that, so I'm using the Scopes monkey trial as one kind of point, but it's not the be all end all. It's not the only thing that helps drive white evangelicals away from kind of public engagement. It comes coupled with a lot of other things. There's the shock of World War I and kind of the technology and the violence that comes out of that. There's also just the massive social and economic changes that are happening in the turn from the 1800s to the 1900s, where more conservative white evangelical populations are coming to see that they aren't the total of the country, right? That there are other forces at work in the country and that they appear to be losing power, right? And so the Scopes monkey trial is a nice punctuating point to see that ridicule and to have this recognition of we're being rejected. And so if you're going to reject us, we're going to turn away from you. And so that's the reason why I used Scopes monkey trial, even though there's a much more complex history that goes on there.
No, that's very helpful. And I think the other questions may get addressed in the rest of your talk.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll jump into part 2 here. I just want to set a timer for myself. Again, I can reference my students. If any of them are out there, they know that I have a real issue with time management. So here, so jumping into the second half of this, so looking at more recent developments within the Christian right. So our story, we basically have gotten up to the 1980s, up to this point in time. And so in the 1980s, we see the creation of the Christian right through the creation of institutions like the moral majority and other kind of related explicitly political organizations. But the 1980s weren't all positive for this newly emergent Christian right. Falwell, the moral majority, and the Christian right as a whole were basically all subject to various forms of scandal and ridicule. This harmed individual reputations and it harmed the collective public image. Also, really importantly, the GOP was yet to fully embrace white evangelicals over the course of the 1980s. Christian right actors were kind of flush with the feeling of success with helping to elect Ronald Reagan, but they really saw little in terms of concrete policy gains. And that led many to feel that they had been captured and sidelined by the GOP. Right? And it would then take years for their influence to really rise within the Republican Party. And so we find in this time period too, the decline of Falwell's influence and then the subsequent rise of Pat Robertson's influence in the later 1980s and into the 1990s. So the moral majority became replaced by Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition as the most prominent Christian right institution. And just like with Jerry Falwell, we can see with Pat Robertson this whole collection of institutions that he has created, again, in media, in the education field, in politics, right? And so the Christian Coalition, with working with Ralph Reed, embraced a bigger tent view of Christianity than Falwell and the moral majority. And they expanded their intention, importantly, to not just national politics, but to state and local politics and government. And this was seen both in terms of running candidates at kind of state and local levels, but really importantly, in terms of providing volunteers for the Republican Party at the state and local level. So the Christian right as a whole became much more effective as it began to both mobilize more voters and become more involved in state and local level GOP Republican Party politics that then really influenced the national party. So all of the above leads to the keys of how this constituency essentially goes from the margins of the GOP to the center of the Republican Party. And elected officials over this time period came to recognize white evangelicals' involvement and dedication as volunteers and as voters, and thus they started to modify their policy positions to match this newly emergent important constituency. So this was a process that took place over years and decades, though, and so in the moment, it could oftentimes be hard to recognize that they were on the road to real political power. Right? Interestingly, this slow but kind of effective political ascent, coupled with some other developments that were going on within the Christian right that might not seem to match. So as they were cultivating political power, they were also cultivating an embattled minority collective identity, right? So we have given up the idea that we are the moral majority. Rather, we are an embattled minority. And this is fueled by seeing themselves in opposition to progressives who they see as having a disproportionate effect on political power. And also it's fueled by their encountering of resistance within the GOP. Right? A second thing that's happening at this time period is that we get the development of institutional capacity in the courts instead of just in the electoral political branches. So in 1999, Paul Weyrich said that, remember Paul Weyrich is essentially the force behind getting Jerry Falwell to create the moral majority. In 1999, he said, "I no longer believe that there is a moral majority, but that does not mean that the war is not going to continue and be fought on other fronts." Cal Thomas and Ed Dobson, other leaders within the Christian right, similarly stated around this time that, quote, "We lacked the power exclusively or even mainly through the political process." So while they're perceiving that their political power is waning in the electoral branches, it helps spur them to start looking at the third and final branch of government, right? To start looking at courts. So Christian and secular conservatives had traditionally avoided courts as a political venue. And this came through a combination of principle, of mistrust of the courts, and also really lacking the awareness and resources of how you use courts effectively in politics. So secular conservatives began a concerted effort to enter the courts as a political forum in the 1980s. You can best see this with the creation of the Federalist Society. You can also see it in the creation of what Stephen Tellis terms second-generation public interest legal organizations. Conservative Christians, however, lagged behind by a solid decade. So they lagged behind their secular counterparts. One of the forces that helped push, or another force really, that helped push the Christian right to recognize the need to be able to enter the courts more effectively were the street politics of abortion. So to quickly define that term, if we go back to the 1980s and we recognize that abortion is one of the main issues that's used to help mobilize this new constituency, and they quickly became frustrated with the Republican Party, which wasn't kind of responding to their interests with policy gains, you get the rise of direct action strategies and protests and blockades going on in front of clinics. This led to many anti-abortion activists getting arrested. So and if they were getting arrested, they needed representation in court. And so because churches were oftentimes used as the organizing venues for direct action abortion strategies, those same churches were used to try to find lawyers. Essentially, people would go to their congregations and ask if anybody out there was a lawyer, and if so, if they could work on behalf of their fellow congregants. And so what you end up in these early days are with, say, a lawyer who traditionally does wills and trusts, doing work in the courts in the criminal venue or the civil venue because of abortion politics. Because this was a prolonged period of abortion politics, it led to repeat court cases, and kind of a ramping up of litigation in other ways, which helped push Christian right actors to recognize that they needed something more than an ad hoc legal response. They needed something more organized. And at this time, we have disparate individuals or small groups of attorneys working around the country on behalf of Christian causes, but they're small, they're underfunded, and thus not that effective. Big shift comes in 1990 with Pat Robertson establishing the ACLJ, the American Center for Law and Justice. Essentially, the way that he created this firm was by collecting the top dispersed solo lawyers that existed around the country and supplied them with budgets, facilities, and thus they were able to take on Christian litigation as a full-time job that was well-funded, and that they had access to kind of the full range of institutional resources that Pat Robertson offered. And it's not at all surprising or an accident that the ACLJ looks a whole lot in its name like the ACLU. Pat Robertson imagined the ACLJ as his response to the ACLU. So over the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s, the number of conservative Christian public interest legal organizations it grows. Individually, if you look at the collection of conservative Christian public interest legal organizations that exists now, their budgets range anywhere from 3 million on the low end to 48.3 million on the high end. So also importantly, with these resources, they've effectively been able to take more and more cases to the United States Supreme Court. Now, it's important to recognize that in the US, courts are a natural extension of traditional political institutions. Alexis de Tocqueville famously wrote in the 1800s, quote, "There's hardly any political question in the United States that sooner or later does not turn into a judicial question." Right? And the reasons for this, I'll give you two of them right now. One of them is that courts offer opportunities to groups that are otherwise limited in the electoral branches. If a group is unpopular, it's hard to get an audience within the elected branches, right? So this is one of the reasons why when we think of the civil rights movement, one of the ways that we oftentimes think about the civil rights movement is through the cases that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund brought, right? Brown versus Board of Education. So courts offer a venue to movements that otherwise might not have traction in traditional political institutions. A second reason why courts often become political venues is that whatever legislative or policy victories a movement might win and manage to secure, it'll oftentimes be challenged in court. And so in order to make a policy victory real and to develop it as a robust policy victory, you oftentimes need to defend it subsequently in court, right? So in thinking about the Christian right over time, they started off really as a politically naive organization or group that overestimated presidential power, a common mistake in the US. But they developed a more nuanced and detailed understanding of politics over the course of the 1980s and into the 1990s. And so we get the creation of these conservative Christian public interest legal organizations as part of this learning process. So now if we go back to the idea of institutions, we can see really established Christian right institutions that target all three branches of government, right? Now, however, while the Christian right leaders were able to create public interest legal organizations using kind of the existing lawyers that were immediately available, they still faced a long-term problem in terms of litigation strategies. So about 20 years ago, Chuck Epp, who's a professor at the University of Kansas, introduced the idea of support structures as a way of explaining the progressive legal movement's policy successes in the courts, right? So thinking about the civil rights movement, thinking about feminist movements and so forth. So the idea is that the victories that they won in court weren't because there was a liberal judiciary. Oftentimes people like to say, there's the Warren Court, that was a liberal court, that's what gave us these kind of seminal cases. Chuck Epp, however, shows you that the rights revolution both precedes and follows the Warren Court and is actually supported by numerous conservative justices. So rather, their victories became because they had the resources necessary, what he terms support structures, to bring what he calls sustained judicial attention to their policy issues. So they were also helped by the fact that there wasn't a lot of adverse precedent at the time, right? Now, for Epp, support structures consist of three things. We've got rights advocacy lawyers, rights advocacy organizations, and financial support. So these are basically the three ingredients that you need to get that sustained judicial attention, to have sustained litigation, right? So while it's not part of his list, he and others, you can see Amanda Hollis-Brusky here and Stephen Tellis in that slide, show that law schools are intimately and kind of variably involved as support structures as well. So in a simplified view from nearly a century ago, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter noted, quote, "The law and the lawyers are what the law schools make them." So in other words, if you want to get change in law and policy, you need to change the ways that legal actors think about the law, right? And to do so, you need to influence legal training and legal scholarship. So this view is kind of borne out by the civil rights movement, as I said, with Chuck Epp's work. And it's also seen in the modern secular conservative legal movement in the Federalist Society and so forth. So, and most recently, this has been recognized by the Christian right. So again, the coming book, Separate Faithful, focuses on newly created Christian conservative law schools and training programs that are meant to function as support structures for this newly created Christian conservative legal movement. So the institutions that Amanda and I specifically look at are Regent University's Law School, Liberty University's Law School, and the Ave Maria School of Law, which is a conservative Catholic law school created by Thomas Monahan. We also look at Alliance Defending Freedom's Blackstone Legal Fellowship. So ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, is the largest conservative Christian public interest law firm. It's the most well-funded one at the time. Pretty much any of the major Christian right cases that you've heard going to court lately are linked to ADF. And in addition to their litigation strategies, they also offer this summer program called the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, what they do is they largely recruit students from elite law schools and bring them to their headquarters in Arizona for a crash course in Christian jurisprudence and litigation strategies. So all of these programs were created with the idea of changing the legal political world. And it's best summed up in a quote from Jerry Falwell in 2007, where he stated that he created his Liberty University Law School out of, quote, the belief that we need to produce a generation of Christian attorneys who could infiltrate the legal profession with a strong commitment to the Judeo-Christian ethic. Right? And you can see that nicely. And so here you have the 5th and the 6th paintings from his mural series at the law school, right? So we go from the first one, which is the breakdown of the rule of law, to the restoration of the rule of law. And you can see there, Jerry Falwell praying, receiving divine inspiration to create Liberty Law School. And then on the other side of the painting, you see a portrait of some of the members of the first graduating class literally descending down upon the Supreme Court, right? So with these two pictures side by side, you see the diagnosing of the problem and the recognition of the solution, right, in the form of the law school that will produce this new generation of Christian attorneys. So as support structures, law schools can supply a whole range of resources that are valuable for movements, right? They can supply human capital in the form of lawyers, intellectual capital in the form of novel legal arguments that those lawyers can make. They create social capital, which is kind of the networks that are necessary for professional advancement. And they can create cultural capital in terms of legitimating ideas and institutions for a movement. So in thinking about how to get these resources, how to get these support structures, we need to also consider what options existed for the Christian right. So one option was what Amanda and I call the infiltration strategy. That is, go into an existing law school. This is kind of a low cost, low risk, but also low control strategy, right? Endow a chair or two to try to get access to legal training. Second, you can have the supplemental strategy, which is to create a parallel institution, like what we've seen with ADF and the Blackstone Legal Fellowship. It's kind of a low to moderate cost, moderate control, and low to moderate risk. And finally, you can get the creation of parallel, wholly new institutions, high cost, high control, but high risk, right? Now, as I said, the supplemental strategy was selected by ADF, but they're alone within the Christian right universe in terms of choosing this strategy. Right? So interviews with ADF personnel showed that they're kind of acutely aware of how the political and legal games work, right? And thus they strive to work within existing frames. They're a very pragmatic organization. So as I said, they recruit students from prestigious institutions and then try to mobilize the capital and the connections that those students come with from their existing law schools, and then direct those students towards the Christian conservative legal movement. And even if those students don't end up joining the movement explicitly, their exposure to it still has value for the ADF and for the movement as a whole. The ADF, however, is an outlier in terms of choosing this strategy, right? Instead, the majority of patrons chose to go with creating wholly new institutions at great expense and at great risk. So another thing to notice here, though, is that the third option, the infiltration option, still existed. They could have invested or tried to invest in law schools like Notre Dame or Pepperdine or Baylor. And these existing law schools, right, they all have conservative orientations. They have clear religious commitments, and they have, most importantly, established reputations, right? And we can see other actors within the secular conservative movement investing in existing organizations, like the Koch brothers' investment in George Mason University's law school. But this was rejected by Christian right patrons and actors for a collection of reasons. One is they had a mistrust of what already existed, right? Not seeing these institutions as being religious enough. And in fact, this is the creation story of Ave Maria. Disaffected faculty from the Catholic Detroit Mercy Law School left and approached Monahan asking him to create a real Catholic law school, something that would be more conservative, right? So it's that rejection of what already exists. Second, it's important to note that looking at the history of these patrons who run these institutions, it also informs likely why they made this choice, right? They have demonstrated over time a real need for strong centralized concern or control, and there's a general lack of cooperation and burden sharing that goes on between these major Christian right leaders. So they have definite views of how the world should be, thus they don't like to compromise, even with ostensible allies, about how to achieve what that world, that world that they want, right? What's more, they also have the start of the infrastructure, as I just kind of discussed in the first half of this talk, right, that enabled the continued development of parallel institution building. So it's worth noting that the same combination of kind of vision and mistrust led to the initial creation of conservative Christian colleges and universities. And so it's kind of a natural extension that we would get these law schools. But it should also be noted that these 20th century created conservative Christian colleges and universities had traditionally been really limited in their scope. They largely trained students for the established social fields that existed within the kind of parallel Christian world. So we find entertainment and broadcast, ministry, teacher training, as I discussed before. Pat Robertson began to break this mold when he initially conceived of Regent University. He conceived of it as having graduate programs that were explicitly oriented towards social and political change, but it didn't include a law school, right? But once he and others kind of identified the importance of law schools in this process of what they wanted to achieve, it's not surprising then that they created new ones. But still, the choice is somewhat odd if you think of it in terms of trying to maximize their impact, right? So new institutions face significant barriers. So for example, it's hard to find credentialed faculty or promising students that are going to be willing to take the risk to come to a brand new law school. Also, if the aim is to change the legal professional world, right, to infiltrate, as Jerry Falwell put it, that requires reputation, prestige, and networks, all of which new schools lack. Right? So while this talk is intended to focus kind of here on the history of things, I want to end here with a fast glimpse towards the present. Right? And so Amanda and I evaluate these 4 programs using a range of measures that are intended to both identify popular recognized forms of capital, but also the ability to stay true to their Christian conservative legal vision, right? So we look at funding, the prestige of faculty scholarship, placement of those of publications, citation and citation placement, connections to the Federal Society, curriculum, admissions data, grad placement, involvement in litigation, so kind of a whole range of variables. And we largely find 6 findings that I can just very quickly summarize here. First, the ADF's supplemental strategy approach with the Blackstone Legal Fellowship appears to be the best at meeting the majority of ends sought by support structures. Second, the schools have had to make a series of compromises around how to realize their missions because of the desire to get financial aid, to get accreditation, and kind of the greater demands of the legal market. But that said, they've found the means to stay true to their religious mission still. Fourth, they've also done a remarkably good job of placing students in the fields of government, public interest litigation, and the educational fields. And the faculty are also relatively highly engaged in mission-driven litigation. That all said, the reputations of these schools are all relatively weak. The bar passage and employment rates are all kind of uneven. And kind of measures of faculty scholarship and influence show that they're largely pushed to the legal academic margins, and they're also lacking collaboration between the schools. And this then leads to the cost-benefit question, especially in comparison to kind of the success of Blackstone, and also in comparison to the broader success of the Christian right in the more traditional political venues. Now, this all noted, using external factors to evaluate these values, or really the value of these law schools, might be somewhat misdirected and not really speak to their value for the Christian right itself, kind of an internal value. And the traditional legal world may not think much of these schools right now, but the popular Christian right audience can definitely see value in them. So when you view yourself as being at war with existing institutions and wary of the political party within which you even exercise significant influence, the mere presence and persistence of these schools are signs of success. Right? Christian conservative law schools and training programs are then possibly best understood as kind of the most recent addition to a longer process of building a parallel institutional world of resistance. Right? So these new institutions were built to provide expertise, but as the past has shown, they may first just feed the Christian right, but over time, they hope to hold significant influence within larger conservative political and legal worlds, and thus within US law, policy, and politics. And so I'll end this formal part of the talk there and open it back up to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I can't imagine a more relevant narrative and arc. We've got lots of good questions here. I'm going to combine some of them because they're clustered a little bit. You've talked about the high risk, high cost of strategy rather than infiltration, the creation of new institutions. One really penetrating question that I would love to hear the answer to is, where does the money come from? And in other words, there's another one that goes a little bit deeper, which is, are we talking about large patrons like Moynihan? Are we talking about grassroots patronage? Give us a picture of where the finances go.
Okay, so that's a great question. So there's, I'm jotting down notes here so that I can try not to forget everything. So when we think about, I'm making another note. Okay, the law schools themselves, the money really comes from the rest of the university. So Liberty Law School is really floated by Liberty University. Same with Regent, same with Ave Maria. One of the important things that Amanda and I found in our study too is that the stability of the schools really depends upon the stability of their funding. And Falwell and Robertson, so now in Falwell Jr., right, they have demonstrated clear commitments to keeping the law schools afloat. We did not find the same thing at Ave Maria. In fact, people we spoke with at Ave said that it was unclear if they got into a really bad financial situation, if Moynihan would bail them out or not. And that financial instability is reflected in various ways. It basically ripples through the entire institution, right, and making it unstable. If we switch to public interest legal organizations, ADF included, they get money from a whole range of sources. So you can find a lot of small donor things. So Aclj constantly solicits donations from kind of the rank and file, just white evangelical population, but they also get money from big donors as well. So they have kind of all forms of money are flowing into these institutions. And ADF was actually the one that had the 48, when I last checked, it was like 48.3, I think, million was their annual budget, right? So it's robust, and that's what fuels the Blackstone Legal Fellowship as well. So.
Very good. We have a great question from Professor Robbins, longstanding faculty member in religious studies, and I'll just read it so I don't screw it up. Previously, it seems the focus had been on the non-establishment clause of the Constitution. It seems to me that now the Christian right seeks to exploit the freedom of expression clause to create a kind of establishment. Comments or thoughts?
You're exactly correct. So, astute observation. So there's a book behind me here. I want to say it's Stephen Brown. I want to say it's Trumping Religion. I could be totally botching that title. But one of the things that he talks about, and this is actually a big, a really active area of study with people who study the Christian right and study litigation, is this real focus on how these conservative Christian public interest legal organizations are pushing religious liberty. It's their new primary strategy, right? And so the issue here now is how much can they fit within the religious liberty umbrella, right? And the question posed exactly kind of a really interesting pivot that happened in the Christian conservative legal world, is that in their early days, they would try to argue based upon kind of the special status of religion, right? And that was the reason that they were, that was the basis of their arguments in court, and they would overwhelmingly lose, right? And the ACLJ and some actors that are pivotal in the ACLJ, including Jay Sekulow, he's one of the founders of the ACLJ. Many people in the audience might have heard of him because he's now Trump's personal lawyer. But he argues that he was part of this group that came up with recognizing that they needed to shift their focus within the First Amendment, and that instead of arguing for the special status of religious speech, what they needed to start to do was actually talk about the lack of a special status of religious speech, but that rather when schools and other state institutions would limit their speech, that they were limiting their speech based on their content. And this is wading into First Amendment jurisprudence. But basically the standard within First Amendment jurisprudence is the state cannot discriminate based on the content of one's speech. And so what they started to argue was the reason why the Christian club can't meet at the public school is because you're discriminating against the content of that speech. And once they made that pivot and started essentially arguing that their speech was no different than any other speech, they started to win cases, right? And that opened up the place where we are now, right? Where they're really pushing on religious liberty to see how far they can go with it. Interestingly, though, last little side note here is this move was actually highly controversial within the Christian right, because essentially what the arguments were saying was the Bible's no different than Hustler magazine. And drawing the equivalency between pornography and the Bible clearly was going to be found as offensive within the community. But it's that type of argument that you need to make if you're going to be effective in the courts. And so this actually gets to other tensions within the Christian right over kind of pragmatism versus principle. And there still are splits within the Christian conservative legal movement over this. But as I said before, ADF, Aclj, they are very pragmatic organizations. And so they're going with pragmatism over principle in this way.
I'd like to push that just a little bit. To what extent are these organizations and their legal strategies taking cues from the civil rights movement? Are there connections there?
Yeah, no, so fundamentally the beginning of it is all about taking cues from the civil rights movement, right? Is that this recognition that, hey, progressives figured out how to do this really well. And essentially what the conservative movement has done, they've been very good students of the progressive movement. And then they figured out how to perfect things, really how to like push it even further. And so there is a lot of kind of inspiration that comes from the civil rights movement. And in fact, actually in the conclusion of the book, one of the things that Amanda and I talk about is looking at Howard University in contrast or in comparison with the law schools that we're looking at. Because Howard University's law school was really a lot of actually in the initial founding of the law school, but really when we get the ramping up of the law school, there is a very explicit social structure idea or support structure idea that the faculty and the leadership had about this was going to be the way with which they were going to achieve change, right? And so there's a definite parallel between what happens with the civil rights movement and what the secular legal movement, and then now specifically the Christian conservative legal movement, are trying to emulate and perfect. So.
That's really fascinating. We have a question from a woman named Wendy Rauter. Professor Wilson, in your opinion, what is the greatest legal accomplishment the Christian right legal work has made to date? And what do you think will be their next major victory?
Good, no, that's a very good question. So these religious liberty cases are as I was saying before, they're the ones to really watch. And so it all depends on what you want to say is how you want to measure kind of significance of something. So really, maybe the most significant one is that those early cases around schools and recognizing this pivot of how they needed to transition within the First Amendment to go towards the free speech clauses as opposed to establishment. I'd say that's kind of really the eureka moment, and thus arguably the most important. But I'm guessing the question is probably more focused on kind of the politics of the last 5 or 10 years. And so I think, let's see, I would not say the Masterpiece Cake Shop is it. Masterpiece Cake Shop did not deliver as much as they were hoping. Something like Town of Greece is probably better. But in terms of looking ahead, we have a really important test case right now that was just heard not all that long ago. And this is actually a way of kind of tying various strands of this talk together. I'm going to get the month wrong because time has become muddled recently. I want to say in February or March, but hey, time. That the Supreme Court heard a case out of Louisiana around Louisiana's regulation of abortion. And this case is really important, not so much because it stands to overturn Roe versus Wade right now. That's highly unlikely. But it stands to overturn a recent case out of Texas, Holman's Health versus Hellerstedt, that there's a much longer story here, but basically that seemed to put an end to the decades-long strategy of the anti-abortion movement as a form of kind of regulation. It appeared to put an end to that. But then shortly, that was in 2016, just a few months after that, the court decided that case, we get the election of Donald Trump and the subsequent reconstitution of the US Supreme Court. They decided to hear this this case out of Louisiana that very closely parallels the Texas case. And so the reason why this is an important one to look at is we all want to see how far the court is going to roll back what they established in their Texas case using this Louisiana case. And why that's important is it suggests how far or what the strategy should be for the Christian right and the anti-abortion movement in going after one of their biggest prizes, right? Arguably the biggest legal prize for this movement, at least within the general population of this movement, is going to be the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And so we're going to have a very interesting insight into their ability and strategy to do that in about a month's time. I would expect that ruling to come out in June. And that's the real big one to watch right now, I'd say.
That's really helpful. We have an interesting question about what happens in these law schools. Terrell Willis writes, what kind of dropout rates do the Christian law schools have? Is there a big exodus of young lawyers? And I'd like to add on to that just a little bit by elaborating, interesting things happen when we educate our students, right? They have their own minds. And so in your study of these institutions, in your interviewing of these students, to what degree can they be expected to deliver on what these institutions expect of them? Do you see?
Yeah, no, those are both great questions. So I don't remember dropout rate stats off the top of my head, but the sign is there too that it doesn't stick out, which I don't remember them as being kind of remarkable, right? And so they have a decent retention rate, especially because the students who go there are motivated to go there. The one major exception here is going to be Ave Maria. Ave Maria, to make a more complex history very short, started off in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. And then Monahan decided to move the law school abruptly to South Florida. And with that move came a lot of chaos within the institution. And in the early days of Ave Maria, they were able to attract really significant students. They were able to explicitly, through rather controversial means, were able to poach really promising students who were going to go to Notre Dame. And they were able to bring them to Ave Maria with the promise of kind of real Catholic law school education and with resources to match. So they had a really high bar passage rate and kind of robust student body. When they moved, they lost faculty, they lost students. Now, a really interesting thing that came out of the interviews there is students would actually use the term mission student. And so they would talk about the division in the student body between mission students and non-mission students. Mission students were the ones who were there for the conservative Catholic legal education. Non-mission students were folks from South Florida who didn't get into other law schools and went there. And there's a massive internal division there that leads to a real instability within the institution. And there wasn't real evidence of this at Liberty or Regent, right? So then the second part of the question that you added onto is essentially where's the human capital that they're producing going? And as I said, it's really uneven, both by year and by institution. And so one of the things that we see in all of these law schools recently is there's a real, and this is kind of in the legal education world more generally, a real pivot towards skills training, right? That, to paraphrase some faculty that I interviewed, there was this concern with, there's no way we're gonna send out lawyers who aren't gonna be practice ready, right? And so some of these schools really restructured the ways that they do legal education to ensure this kind of baseline legal capacity. But when you do that, right, it's kind of a zero-sum game. If you're increasing that part of your education, you're probably taking away from the more mission-based elements. But these schools have found ways to preserve the mission elements as well, right? And then as far as placement rates, as I said, they really vary by year and by institution. But the one really remarkable thing is, in comparison to a selection of other law schools that we looked at, they're doing a better job of placing students in government, placing students in public interest legal organizations, and placing students in the education field. Unfortunately, the data that's available for this doesn't allow you to really dig deeply into this, but just kind of those initial statistics show a higher volume than, say, like a Notre Dame or a George Mason, which is located in New York, and one is very well connected within the conservative legal world. So again, mixed bag.
Mixed bag, and you talked about the bar passage rate, right?
Yeah, and again, mixed bag there as well. You can find them having, really trumpeting their bar passage rate and then having problems another year and then coming back up. I'll add one other way, though, that these schools have tried to really establish themselves in the legal world is through their debate teams. And so Regent is really proud of their debate team going out, and they love to trumpet when, if a Liberty or Regent mock trial team beats a Duke or beats a Harvard or beats a Stanford. It's a huge coup, right? And so they're really trying to leverage those elements of their law schools to try to show their value and show their why they deserve respect, really.
Right. We have one question that I think is a nice way to move toward wrapping up, from David Kenny. What sparked your interest in the Christian right, and what's maintained that interest as a scholar?
No, that's a really good question. It's funny because I always, whenever I try to invite people that scholars that my students read the books of, I try to get as many of them to kind of Skype into class or Zoom into class as possible. And this is always one of the guidelines that I give speakers is like, tell them about how you became interested in something, because students always have a hard time kind of figuring out a research area, right? My story is a really accidental one. I'll make it very short, but essentially when I was in graduate school, the program I was in at Berkeley is called Jurisprudence and Social Policy. It's a PhD department within the law school. And so I would take a mix of law school classes and PhD classes. And one of my professors was a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And one of the things that really mattered for me in coming up with a dissertation topic was, well, as you said in the beginning, I was an English major as an undergrad. I love storytelling. I needed to have a compelling story to keep myself engaged. And also I wanted to have a real storytelling element in anything that I wrote, right? And so I went to Professor Fletcher's office and I just said, tell me about interesting cases that are going through the Ninth Circuit right now. And he told me about an abortion violence case that was working its way through the court. And that really caught my attention as something that was really interesting. I wasn't ever particularly invested in abortion politics before. I actually had lots of reasons to kind of avoid abortion politics. But this case led me to start to discover this whole range of cases that the Supreme Court had heard about the regulation of abortion protesting. And I was really interested in the First Amendment. And so I kind of viewed myself as actually writing kind of a First Amendment dissertation using these abortion cases. But then through studying these cases, I actually came across the ACLJ because they were involved in a lot of these cases. And then when I was researching what the ACLJ was, their original offices, and I think this is fascinating, it's what led to the idea of this book, was their original offices were on the third floor, could be second, I can't quite remember, but basically one of the top floors of the then existing Regent University Law School building. And it immediately clicked that, wow, they have an incredibly comprehensive view of how litigation works, right? You have the ground floor is the law school, and the cream will kind of literally / figuratively rise to the top, right? They'll be able to glean the best students from this law school and plug them in to Christian litigation. And I was like, that is some savvy thinking. And so from that point on, I was basically sold on looking at the Christian conservative legal movement. And then of course, if you're going to study the Christian conservative legal movement, you need to study the Christian right. And I love this area in part because not a lot of people study conservative politics. And so it's a nice kind of open area. There's a kind of a small group of us tends to be a supportive group of scholars. I find it kind of endlessly interesting just because of the innovation angle of this. And they're kind of a great case study because they're new enough that you can see the beginning of everything and still talk to those people, but they're old enough that they have established track records that you can study. And so it's just a really convenient model for scholarship.
Thank you. That's a wonderful origin story. I just can't tell you selfishly how relevant this talk has been for my students, the way it helps us understand the 20th century in terms of politics, the production of knowledge, the history of ideas. And I will tell all of you listening that Professor Wilson is part of, like he said, a very small community of historians of political movements, of political scientists, who are rewriting our understanding of 20th century conservatism. And this is a really creative and open-ended and exciting field. For all those reasons, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Wilson for showing us this cutting-edge area of research that will be available to the public this fall. I want to express my deep, abiding, and sincere thanks to Nancy Livingston for being a supporter of the University of Denver, the History Department, and the college for decades. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight. We know that you have so many claims on your time, that it is such an unsettled period in our history, and we're deeply grateful that you made time to hear Professor Wilson, and thank you all for those wonderful questions. We encourage you to continue to connect with the DU community with all the things that are coming up. The best way to do that is by visiting connected.du.edu. Thank you again for coming out, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you very much.